must have in order to have a hot. On the second proposal, no intrinsic difference in states of pain or other sensory states grounds the phenomenal difference. Instead, the phenomenal properties turn on the extrinsic features of the state, namely whether the creature is aware of itself as being in that first-order state. There's nothing it's like for such a creature to be in pain, not because the state of pain in that creature is intrinsically different, but because the creature lacks the relevant access to itself and to that state of pain. Is Neocartesian theodicy available only to those who accept functionalist theories of phenomenal consciousness? Indeed not. Those who think phenomenal consciousness is an intrinsic qualitative feature of first-order states can concede that this is a further similarity between humans and other creatures, while persisting in the belief that only humans have higher-order access to these first-order states. So we would get this third Neocartesian proposal. Some non-human creatures have states that have intrinsic phenomenal qualities analogous to those possessed by humans when they're in states of pain. These creatures lack, however, any higher-order states of being aware of themselves as being in the first-order states. They have no access to the fact that they're having a particular feeling, though they are indeed having it. Since phenomenal properties of states of pain and other sensory states are intrinsic to the states themselves, there's no difference on this score between humans and other creatures. Now, one might object to this strange view by arguing that there's moral disvalue in a world in which there are many organisms possessing mental states that have phenomenal features characteristic of painful sensations. Access to these states, the critic might contend, is irrelevant to whether it's bad to be in the state itself. Clearly, if a state's intrinsically bad, it's not made better merely in virtue of the fact that the creature doesn't know about it. But this objection misses the mark. For defenders of this third proposal, no less than those defending the second, can plausibly respond that so long as an animal lacks the higher order access, so long as it can't represent itself as being in a state of pain, there's nothing about its situation that's of intrinsic moral disvalue. For lacking any such access, there's simply no victim, no subject for whom it can be said that there's a way it's like for it to be in such a state of pain. Does Neocartesian CD require that other creatures lack any higher order access to states of pain? Not at all. For even if an animal has higher order access to a first order state of pain, it would lack any moral disvalue if the animal didn't find that state to be undesirable. Such a mental state might bear some similarity to the conscious experience of someone with a damaged or absent prefrontal cortex. Individuals who have undergone a prefrontal lobotomy, for example, have reported an awareness of familiar pains, but paradoxically insisted that they no longer found the pain to be undesirable or unpleasant. They claim the pain feels the same, even though it no longer bothers them. As a result, creatures of this sort have first-order pain states and second-order awareness of them, but because they lack the capacity to regard those states as undesirable, such creatures don't suffer because of their pain. We then have available a fourth Neocartesian proposal. Most creatures lack the cognitive faculties required to be in a higher order state of recognizing themselves to be in a first order state of pain. Those that can on occasion achieve a second order access to their first order states of pain, nonetheless don't have the capacity to regard that second order state as undesirable. Common to all of these Neocartesian proposals is the thesis that non-human creatures lack some psychological capacity that grounds a morally significant distinction adequate for a CD. The successful Neocartesian CD must steer around a rock of Scylla and not exaggerate the psychological differences between humans and non-humans, but it must avoid the whirlpool of Charybdis by not leaving unexplained states in animals that simply aren't good. Constructing a successful CD requires that the components be such that we're not justified or warranted in rejecting them in light of what we accept. However, some might argue that the Neocartesian position set out above fail to get over even this very low hurdle, since some things we accept or ought to accept do warrant their rejection. The first thing we accept or ought to accept is the evidence of ethology, neuroscience, and evolution, which render these descriptions of animal mentality untenable. Second, we accept the claim that animals are fit subjects for our moral concern, but one might argue the Neocartesian view undercuts any grounds for such moral concern. Well, unfortunately, I can't address those two objections right now, or if I did, that would be the only thing we'd get to in this talk. But they are objections that are eminently worth addressing. But if the Neocartesian has resources for responding to such objections, the view is one that we might perhaps have to take seriously. Perhaps some will find a Neocartesian position congenial, but most will not. In fact, I suspect most would agree with former Bush speechwriter turned animal welfare advocate Matthew Scully, who writes, and this is on the handout as well, the idea that animals don't experience physical pain comparable to our pain, as Stephen R. L. Clark observes, has never satisfied anyone without something to gain. That assumption may now once and for all be discarded as rubbish. Modern science has now confirmed what mankind suspected all along, with a prima facie case that of course animals suffer, of course they have emotions, and of course they're conscious beings. This is not an expression of sentiment, it's not a statement of ideology, it's neither an avowal nor a denial of any it's neither an avowal nor a denial of any tenet of religion or philosophy. It's a statement of fact, objective reality as best we can discern it. 3 centuries after Descartes likened the crying of animals to broken machinery, no serious person can say that anymore. Well, all of us surely want to be serious persons. So if we take Scully's admonition with the gravity with which he intends it, we're going to have to settle for a view that holds animal suffering to be permissible as a means to securing some outweighing goods, either for the animal itself or for the goodness of creation in some global sense, or both. Time doesn't permit me to catalog the various options that I think are available in the 2 categories, so let me just consider one proposed good, specifically one which benefits the animals themselves. We might suppose, for example, that contrary to our initial expectations, the possibility of animal pain and suffering is indeed good for the animals themselves. In the late 1940s, Dr. Paul Brand was recruited to India to help serve the crippling needs of patients with leprosy or Hansen's disease. Hansen's disease results from a bacterial infection, and its consequences are debilitating and lifelong. As the disease advances, patients experience paralysis and degeneration of digits and limbs with an accompanying loss of pain sensation. As a result of the paralysis, many patients are left with hands deformed into a shape of a useless claw, a defining characteristic of those with the disease. Brand began work on some pioneering procedures aimed at reversing the effects of the paralysis and restoring functionality to hands and feet of his patients. However, he found the battle against the degeneration was exacerbated as functionality was increased. His patients were almost all quarantined in a leprosarium where they lived and received their medical treatment, typically without hope of ever being released. Brand describes one patient, Sadan, who came to the leprosarium with severe deformities in his hands and feet as a result of the disease. Through a series of hand surgeries, physicians were able to restore substantial functionality to his hands. In fact, Sadan had gone on to get a job as a typist. But despite the success, the condition of Sadan's feet continued to decline significantly. Several doctors had recommended that his legs be amputated below the knees as a way of halting the progressive degeneration and the accompanying infection which threatened to take over the rest of his body. Brand continued to treat Sadan's feet, now shortened by half and covered with aggressive ulcers that stretched from the heels to the rounded, toeless ball. Despite the regular change of dressing and aggressive use of antibiotics, his condition worsened. Brand describes a defining visit with Sadan when he returned to the clinic to have his dressing changed for the 10th time in a single day. Because the disease had destroyed his ability to feel pain, Sadan sat quietly as Brand unwrapped the bloody, infected bandages. Finally coming to the realization that Sadan would never recover from his horrifying condition, he agreed to recommend the amputation procedure that others had been commending all along. Sadan accepted the news with resignation. Brand rebandaged his feet, and as he watched Sadan walk down the steps and across the sidewalk, he noticed something important. Despite the fact that Brand had just spent half an hour cleaning out a grossly abscessed wound on the ball of his foot, he was walking without even a hint of a limp. During the whole course of his treatment, he continued to walk in a way that put his full weight on the damaged tissue they had been so carefully treating. He was able to do this only because his disease had robbed him of the capacity to feel any pain in his feet. Anyone else would have been unable to walk on such horribly crippled feet at all, but Sadan, blind to the injury he was inflicting on himself with each step, continued to grind the inflamed and infected skin, muscle, and bone into his unforgiving shoes. Brand went on to surmise and later to show conclusively that in fact all of the tissue injury and degeneration experienced by patients with Hansen's disease was caused by injuries that patients had quite unwittingly incurred because of their inability to feel pain. Living tissues must be able to grow and react to injury in such a way that they either prevent further damage or regenerate, or both. This in turn requires that these tissues have the capacity for recognizing injurious or noxious stimuli and for responding appropriately to them. One of the most important defense mechanisms against noxious stimuli is inflammation. When tissues are exposed to a powerful noxious stimulus, being hit by a baseball, for example, the body first reacts by causing an inflammation in the area. This not only allows a greater amount of blood flow, thus enhancing the oxygenation of tissues and flooding them with immune cells, but also increases pressure on pain sensors, or nociceptors as they're called, which makes them correspondingly more sensitive. As a result of the greater sensitivity, we feel even more pain when the same area receives further noxious stimulation. The result is that we're more protective of the damaged tissue, which allows it to heal and to regenerate. It's this reaction which causes us to limp when we experience tissue damage in our foot or leg. The tenderness caused by the inflammation makes the affected area especially sensitive, leading us to alter our gait to keep from putting pressure on it. It was this sort of reaction that was lacking in Saddam, and which thus prevented his healing. Considerations of this sort reinforce one very common reaction we have when confronted with the question, why does God allow his creatures to experience pain? That common reaction is to point to the fact that pain is exceedingly useful in keeping us from injury. If it weren't for pain, we wouldn't withdraw our hands from flames or stop the piercing blade of the knife. Perhaps then animal pain and suffering is permitted by God because pain and suffering is necessary for living organisms to survive in a physical environment governed by physical laws. If it's good for God to create animals in the first place, then it's good for those animals to be susceptible to feelings of pain. Of course, one might wonder why we should think it's a good thing to create physical organisms in the first place, and why it's good for those organisms to exist in an environment that's law-like. We would then need to give some consideration to the question of whether or not there might be some other way of promoting the end of preserving the integrity of the animal organism without pain and suffering. I'll spend most of my time focusing on that last question. Let me say something briefly about the first, and I'll leave the second one wholly to the side. In reflecting on the doctrine of creation, Christian thinkers have generally held that God engages in the act of creation out of the overflowing abundance of his own good nature. This allows God to bring into existence creatures which might both share in the divine goodness and that might make that goodness fully manifest. It's common in the Christian tradition to hold that these two goals are achieved, at least in part, by God producing a creation that's diverse. In this way, creaturely diversity is an intrinsically good feature of creation, since by it the divine goodness is fully manifest. So St. Thomas, for example, writes as follows, this is on the handout, "For he brought things into being in order that his goodness might be communicated to creatures and be represented by them. And because his goodness could not be adequately represented by one creature alone, he produced many and diverse creatures, that what was wanting to one in the representation of the divine goodness might be supplied by another. For goodness, which in God is simple and uniform, in creatures is manifold and divided, and hence the whole universe together participates in the divine goodness more perfectly and represents it better than any single creature whatever."